They were Baton Rouge's notorious twin terrors, whispered about in the neighborhood, feared even in their own home. The kind of boys who seemed born from the shadows, leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. But no one, not even their own family, could have imagined the nightmare they would eventually unleash. It all seemed like a twisted game to them. Cruelty became second nature, their every move an attempt to dominate and break the spirit of those around them. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what would happen one fateful night, deep in the woods, under the cover of darkness. A terrified girl, bound and bruised, begging for her life, and the two boys who only laughed. How does unchecked evil fester behind closed doors? How can cruelty, nurtured from childhood, grow into something so monstrous that even family isn't spared? What happens when the very people who should protect you are the ones who destroy you? Stay with us, because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about monsters hiding in plain sight. Before we dive into this chilling case, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more haunting tales where darkness wears a familiar face. Tajion and Talon Brewster were born into a world where love was scarce, and violence was an uninvited but constant guest. Their mother, Chantrelle, was just 24 years old when they came into the world, already trapped in a cycle of addiction and rage that would define their early years. She was volatile, unpredictable, a woman whose love was drowned in the haze of substance abuse, leaving her boys to fend for themselves in an environment of constant chaos. Their father? He disappeared when the twins were just 2 years old, another casualty of the poverty-stricken streets they called home. He was a ghost, a man who couldn't even be bothered to leave a memory behind. All Tajion and Talon had were empty promises and the pain of his absence. It was just Chantrelle and her two boys, each one growing up faster than they should have, each one left to navigate a world that never gave them a chance. By the time the twins were 15, they had already left their mark on the neighborhood. Animal cruelty, petty thefts, and violent assaults were just the beginning. The two of them had been in and out of trouble so many times that the local police knew their names by heart, their faces burned into the officers' memories as the boys who could never be stopped, no matter how many times they were caught. They were known as troublemakers, the kind of boys whose very presence made people uneasy, and they thrived in it. Chantrelle, their mother, never tried to intervene. She didn't see them as the problem. Instead, she excused their actions, even encouraged their destructive tendencies. The very things that should have been seen as warning signs were brushed off. Her boys weren't bad, she'd say. They were just misunderstood, just reacting to the world around them, a world that had never been kind to them. Every broken window, every stolen purse, every brutal fight was justified in her mind. They were only doing what they had to do to survive, to stand their ground in a world that never offered them any protection. By 15, Tajion and Talon's reputations were solidified. In their neighborhood, their names weren't just known, they were feared. When you heard, "Those Brewster boys," you knew trouble was close. Their faces were like a warning sign. Trouble ahead, stay away. The local store owners kept an eye on them when they came in, afraid that their visit would mean a lost product or worse. Parents would hurry their children inside when they saw the twins walking down the street, making sure the doors were locked and the windows were shut tight. The Brewster boys had become a living, breathing symbol of danger, of unpredictability. And it wasn't just the neighborhood. The police knew them, too. Every time they showed up, it was as if the officers were expecting them, like it was just a matter of time before they would land in cuffs again. But no matter how many times they were caught, no matter how much trouble they caused, nothing ever seemed to stick. They had a way of slipping through the cracks, always getting out, always going back to their next act of violence, always ready to push the envelope even further. For Tajion and Talon, violence wasn't just a way of life. It was who they were. It was how they got noticed, how they made people pay attention. There were no lessons about right and wrong, no guidance about consequences. All they knew was that the world had given them nothing, and they would take what they wanted, no matter the cost. And in a world that had abandoned them, they had come to believe that chaos was the only thing they could rely on. Chantrelle, meanwhile, continued down the same destructive path. She didn't care about the damage her boys were causing. She only cared that they didn't get caught, that they didn't embarrass her. She never questioned their actions, never asked if they could do better. She simply continued to fuel their worst impulses, allowing them to sink deeper into the darkness. The world had already marked them as lost causes, and they were only just getting started. What came next would be something the world would never forget. When Chantrell remarried Darnell Claiborne, it was supposed to mark the beginning of a new life for her and her sons, Tajion and Talon. Darnell, a soft-spoken mechanic with a humble spirit, had just begun to rebuild his life after the death of his wife, Mariah, who died from breast cancer a year before. He thought he was offering his daughter, Mycaria, a safe place to heal from the grief of losing her mother. Mycaria, only 13, had been a bright-eyed girl with dreams far beyond her small world, dreams of becoming a pediatrician, of helping others, of making her mother proud. The thought of moving into Darnell's home should have been the start of something better, something brighter. But instead, it quickly became a descent into darkness. The twins, Tajion and Talon, were notorious for their cruelty, their presence in the neighborhood synonymous with violence and chaos. At 16, they had already seen more of the world's ugliness than most people ever would, their lives marred by poverty, neglect, and addiction. They had been abandoned by their father when they were just 2 years old and raised in the harshest of circumstances by their mother, Chantrell, whose erratic behavior and volatile nature only served to fuel the worst in them. So, when she remarried Darnell, it wasn't out of any sense of familial harmony. It was a chance to exert control over something new, to take what little peace Darnell had left and turn it into yet another battleground. And when Mycaria walked into that home, she became their target. They saw her as an intruder, a soft, sheltered girl who had no place in their world. In their eyes, Mycaria was everything they hated: kind, gentle, and far too naive for the harsh realities they had come to know. Her presence in the house was a constant reminder of everything they felt they were owed but never received: love, stability, and protection. And she had it all, or at least the chance to have it, something the twins would never allow. The abuse began almost immediately. At first, it was small, little taunts, whispers when Mycaria passed by, the mocking nicknames, Charity Case, Roach, and Ugly Duck. But it wasn't just the name-calling. They would follow her around, step on her books, steal her pencils, and rip up the homework she worked so hard on. Mycaria was bewildered, hurt, and confused. Why were they so mean to her? She had done nothing wrong. She just wanted to fit in, to be part of this new family, but everything she did only seemed to make them hate her more. The twins found sick pleasure in her tears, in watching her crumble under the weight of their relentless torment. What they couldn't understand, what Chantrell refused to acknowledge, was that they were breaking her. And Chantrell? Well, she didn't see it that way. To her, Mycaria was too soft, too sensitive, and not tough enough for the life they had built. She blamed her for the growing tension in the house, for every argument between the boys and Darnell. "You need to toughen up," Chantrell would say, as if it were Mycaria's fault that her new brothers were tearing her down. Darnell tried to intervene, tried to stand up for Mycaria, but each time he did, Chantrell would silence him, telling him that it was just the way things were. She would laugh it off, tell him it was nothing to worry about. "Boys will be boys," she'd say, dismissing her son's cruelty as if it were some natural stage in their lives that would pass. But Darnell knew something wasn't right. He saw the hurt in Mycaria's eyes, heard her cries when she thought no one was listening. He couldn't understand how Chantrell, a woman who had once been a mother herself, could turn a blind eye to the suffering in her own home. But Chantrell was no ordinary mother. She had long since abandoned her own maternal instincts, too consumed by her loyalty to her sons to see the damage they were causing. In her eyes, they were still her babies, the ones she had raised through the worst of conditions. She would never let anyone, not even her new husband, come between her and them. And so, Mycaria remained the outsider, the girl who didn't belong, the one who was too weak to defend herself against the storm that raged around her. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the Claiborne household grew increasingly toxic. What had started as taunts, insults, and subtle sabotage escalated into a full-blown campaign of cruelty, one so twisted that it would take years for anyone to even begin to comprehend the depths of the Brewster twins' malice. The torment Micaiah endured was no longer confined to cruel words or petty vandalism. The twins, Tashayan and Talon, had tasted power over her, and it only fueled their desire to break her down further. It began with simple pranks, locking her in dark closets, taking away her food, and throwing her possessions away, just to watch her panic. But soon, the games became more sinister. Micaiah's once neatly organized room was turned into a disaster zone, with her clothes torn to pieces and her personal items vandalized. They filmed it all. The worst, however, came when they humiliated her in front of their friends, posting videos online of their cruel actions. Taunting her, mocking her as she cried, and turning her suffering into entertainment. Each time she tried to fight back, each time she tried to stand up for herself, the twins found a way to crush her spirit even further. It wasn't just the physical violence, though that was horrible enough. It was the mind games, the psychological warfare that slowly drove her to the edge of her sanity. Then came the basement. It was a night that would haunt Micaiah's soul forever, a night when the nightmare turned into something far worse. She was just 14 years old. Tajayan and Talon had spent the evening tormenting her, as usual. But that night, their cruelty reached a level beyond anything Micaiah had endured. While Darnell was working a late shift and Chantrell was drunk in her bedroom, Tyjon and Talon lured her down into the basement under the pretense of an apology, a false promise of peace, and the moment she was alone with them in the dark, they overpowered her. The twins tied her up, each movement deliberate, slow, like they were savoring the power they held over her. They beat her mercilessly, forcing her to submit to their twisted demands. They filmed it all not because they were angry, but because to them, it was nothing more than a game. They laughed as she cried, as she begged for mercy, as she pleaded with them to stop. And in that moment, when Micaiah's body and spirit were breaking, the one person who should have protected her, Chantrell, was nowhere to be found. She had heard the screams, the sounds of Micaiah's suffering, but she chose to ignore them. When she finally did show up, it wasn't to rescue her daughter. It wasn't to comfort her. Instead, Chantrell stood in the doorway of the basement, looking down at Micaiah, battered and broken, and she placed the blame on the wrong person. "She's too soft," Chantrell spat, her voice thick with disdain. "She needs to learn to take it. Stop coddling her." Those words, those poisonous words, rang in Micaiah's ears like a death sentence. Her mother, the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally, had chosen her sons over her, as she always had. The twins were never wrong in Chantrell's eyes. They were just acting out, just being boys. And Micaiah? She was too fragile, too weak to survive in a world that was unforgiving, too soft to stand up for herself. But Micaiah was not soft. She was a survivor. Despite the beatings, despite the torment, despite everything that had been done to her, she held on to the belief that one day, someone would see through the facade of her tormentors. Someone would intervene, and the cruelty would end. But she had no idea how wrong she was. No one was coming. Over the next few weeks, Micaiah withdrew completely. She stopped eating, stopped smiling, stopped dreaming. The system, which should have been her lifeline, failed her. It all began when Micaiah's teachers started to notice the signs. They saw the bruises, the signs of neglect, and they reported it to Child Protective Services. It was supposed to be the first step toward rescuing Micaiah, but when CPS came knocking on Chantrell's door, they were met with lies and manipulation. Chantrell was a master of deflection, of spinning a narrative that painted her as the victim, as the misunderstood mother just trying to make it through life. She told them that Micaiah was a troubled girl, that her daughter was rebellious, and that she was just too sensitive. She made it seem as though the problem was Micaiah, not the twisted behavior of her sons. And so, the case was closed. No one questioned Chantrell's version of events. No one asked about the bruises, about the psychological torment, about the videos that had been posted online. No one cared to look deeper into the family dynamic that was rotting from the inside out. Mycaria was left utterly defenseless, abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect her. It was a cruel twist of fate that sealed her doom. The people who were supposed to help her only contributed to the nightmare she was living. The torment continued, the psychological wounds deepened, and Mycaria was left to wonder, how could a world that promised protection be so blind to her suffering? The Brewster twins had succeeded. They had broken her in every way imaginable, and their mother, the one person who should have stopped them, had chosen to stand by her sons no matter the cost. Mycaria had no one left, no one who cared, no one who could stop the relentless torment that had consumed her life. The final horror came on a rainy November night. It happened on a cold, wet night in November, a night where the rain fell like it was trying to cleanse the earth of the horror that was about to unfold. Tajian and Talon Brewster, now 17 years old, had spent weeks planning what they chillingly called the final show. A plan so cruel, so calculated, it seemed impossible that two teenagers could be capable of it. But they were, and they were proud of it. They approached Mycaria Claiborne with fake smiles and hollow words, telling her they had a birthday surprise hidden for her out in the woods behind their house. It wasn't even close to her birthday, but Mycaria, fragile and desperate for even a sliver of kindness, wanted so badly to believe. Maybe, just maybe, after all the pain, they had finally decided to make peace. Maybe the nightmare was finally over. So she followed them. She followed them past the back porch, through the overgrown yard, and into the woods where the trees hung low and the ground was slick with rain. Every step deeper into the darkness was another step away from safety, but Mycaria didn't turn back. Her hope, that dangerous, blinding hope, kept her moving forward. It wasn't until they reached a clearing, a small, muddy hollow, that she realized something was wrong. There was no gift. There were no smiles anymore. Only the cold, cruel glint in Tajian and Talon's eyes, and the figure of another boy, stepping out from the shadows. A friend they had brought along, a third predator, someone Mycaria barely knew but who had been hidden in plain sight. Before she could scream, before she could run, they were on her. The attack was sudden, brutal, and horrifying in its intensity. All three of them, fueled by a sick, shared hatred, unleashed a level of violence that defied comprehension. They held her down in the mud, tearing at her clothes, striking her, laughing at her terror. In a devastating escalation of their cruelty, they subjected her to a violent sexual assault so savage that medical examiners would later struggle to describe the full extent of her injuries. Her body was torn, delicate tissue ripped apart with merciless force. She was left broken inside and out, struggling to stay conscious as the rain pounded down around her. But even that wasn't enough for the twins. When Mycaria lay barely breathing, her body convulsing weakly in the freezing mud, Tajian and Talon revealed what they had hidden beneath their jackets, metal pipes, slick with rainwater and cold as ice. Without hesitation, without a shred of mercy, they raised the pipes and began to beat her. Over and over, the sound of metal crashing against flesh echoed through the trees. They shattered her ribs. They crushed her fingers when she tried to shield her face. They stomped on her chest with their steel-toed boots, driving the air from her lungs, snapping bone against bone. Mycaria's faint cries for help became whimpers, and then silence. Still not satisfied, they continued. They made sure there was no chance of her getting back up. No chance of her telling anyone what they had done. When they were certain she was no longer moving, that her small, battered body had given out, they left her there. Face down in a shallow, muddy ditch, half submerged in rainwater. The storm did what it could to wash away the blood, the footprints, the broken pieces of the girl they had destroyed. Nature itself seemed desperate to erase the scene of such evil. And as the rain fell harder, as the woods grew darker, the Brewster twins and their accomplice walked away. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They laughed. They joked. They talked about the attack like it was a prank, a game they had just won. Their muddy footprints faded with the downpour, disappearing into the soaked earth, just like they intended. Back at home, Chantrelle didn't ask where they had been. She didn't ask why their clothes were soaked and stained. If she noticed at all, she said nothing. The final betrayal was complete, and not a single soul, it seemed, was coming to save Micaiah Claiborne. That night, under the cover of rain and darkness, innocence was destroyed, and monsters were born. Darnell Claiborne knew something was wrong the moment the house grew too quiet. Micaiah, his bright, sweet girl, had never stayed out late, never without telling him first. He searched the neighborhood frantically, shouting her name into the night, checking every corner, every shadow. His hands trembled as he called hospitals, begged neighbors for help. And all the while, Chantrelle Brewster sat stone-faced on the living room couch, her eyes cold, her arms folded tightly across he nightmare ended, but not the way Darnell had prayed for. A group of hunters, moving through the woods beyond the Brewster house, stumbled upon a body half buried in a muddy ditch. Bloated from the rain, bruised beyond recognition, the small figure looked more like a broken doll than a child. Only when they turned her over and saw the frozen mask of terror on her face did they realize the horror they had found. It was Micaiah. The town of Baton Rouge erupted. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, igniting rage and heartbreak in equal measure. Candlelight vigils sprung up overnight. Flyers with Micaiah's smiling face, a face now burned into the community's collective grief, blanketed every gas station, every corner store, every telephone pole. Strangers wept for a girl they had never met, a girl whose story had been hidden behind closed doors until it ended in unspeakable tragedy. The investigation that followed was swift, merciless, and damning. Detectives seized Tajian and Talon's phones, and what they found turned stomachs. There, preserved like trophies, were months of horror. Videos of the twins mocking Micaiah, trapping her, beating her, tearing at every shred of her dignity while laughing into the camera. And among the digital rot were the final, damning clips from that rainy November night. Blurred, shaky footage of a girl's last moments alive, her faint cries drowned out by cruel laughter. Even the videos they had tried to delete were recovered. Digital forensic teams unearthed text messages where Tajian and Talon bragged about what they had done, speaking in sickening detail about the final show they had orchestrated. There was no doubt left. DNA pulled from the crime scene tied all three boys directly to Micaiah's final hours. When confronted, Tajian and Talon showed no fear, no shame. They laughed during interrogations, sneering at detectives, mocking Micaiah's suffering like it was some inside joke only they understood. Their arrogance was chilling, almost otherworldly. But their so-called friend didn't share their loyalty. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, he cracked. He took a plea deal in exchange for testifying, unloading every gruesome detail he knew. The planning, the luring, the assault, the savage beating, every monstrous second of Micaiah's final night. The public's horror deepened with every revelation. News outlets across Louisiana and beyond seized on the story, dubbing it the Brewster Brothers Horror. Baton Rouge became a city in mourning and a city demanding justice. Micaiah's name became a rallying cry, a reminder of what cruelty unchecked could destroy. And still, beneath all the outrage and heartbreak, one chilling truth lingered in the air like smoke. The monsters had been among them all along. And no one had heard Micaiah's screams until it was far, far too late. The trial of Tajian and Talon Brewster became the most-watched courtroom drama Baton Rouge had seen in decades. The courtroom overflowed with people, some seeking justice, some simply trying to understand how two 17-year-olds could commit such pure evil. But if anyone had come hoping to see remorse, they would leave disappointed. From the moment the twins entered the courtroom, they treated the proceedings like a joke. They smirked at the cameras, whispered and chuckled with each other during testimony. When the prosecution played the horrific Snapchat videos for the jury, showing months of torment leading up to Mycaria's final night. The twins didn't flinch. They didn't lower their heads. They laughed. In the middle of it all sat Darnell Claiborne, his face hollowed by grief. When he took the stand, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. His voice cracked as he spoke about the daughter he lost. The little girl who used to fall asleep clutching medical textbooks, who had dreamed of healing others, who had trusted too easily and paid the ultimate price. Every word was a dagger, carving into the jury's hearts. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, except for Tajian and Talon, who yawned and rolled their eyes as Darnell's testimony filled the air. The prosecution left no room for doubt. They painted the twins not just as killers, but as creatures devoid of even basic humanity. They detailed the cruelty, the planning, the pleasure they took in Mycaria's suffering. They described how even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the twins refused to show the faintest flicker of guilt or shame. In their final statement, the prosecutor called them black holes in human skin, entities that consumed everything good and left only devastation behind. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, conspiracy. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life without the possibility of parole for both Tajian and Talon, there was a heavy silence, broken only by the twins snickering under their breath. Their accomplice, the so-called friend who had traded his soul for a plea deal, wasn't spared either. He was sentenced to 35 years behind bars, eligible for parole only after 25. He cried when he heard his fate, real tears, but far too late to matter. Justice, some said, had been served. But no sentence, no punishment, could bring back the life that was stolen or heal the wound that had ripped through Baton Rouge. The cold hearts of Tajian and Talon Brewster would spend the rest of their lives behind concrete and steel. Yet for those who loved Mycaria Claiborne, the real sentence was living every day without her, knowing her light had been extinguished by two boys who once walked so easily among them. Some evil is born, some evil is made. In the case of Tajian and Talon Brewster, it was both. A darkness that started early, fed by silence, neglect, and cruelty until it grew into something uncontrollable, something deadly. They were monsters created not overnight, but over years, in a home where violence was normal and cries for help were dismissed. And when that evil finally erupted, it destroyed the most innocent soul among them, a bright-eyed girl whose only crime was wanting to belong. It leaves us with a question that haunts long after the headlines fade. Could Mycaria have been saved if someone had listened sooner? If one teacher, one neighbor, one family member had pushed harder, looked closer, refused to be fooled, would her story have ended differently? And beyond that, how many more children are out there right now, silently suffering, just waiting for someone to see them before it's too late? If this story gripped you, like and subscribe for more tales that expose the chilling truths hiding behind everyday lives. You think you know your neighbors. You think you understand your town. But sometimes, the darkest horrors are the ones closest to home.